The first time Evelyn Hale saw the ridge, it was wearing a shawl of morning fog that bunched and frayed as the sun tugged at its edges. She stood in the wagon ruts with a hand braced against her carpet bag and let the air of cedar pass fill her lungs. It was clean and cold, touched by pine and the faint iron scent of stones after rain. She thought of Boston smoke and the cramped rows of brick where sorrow had followed her from door to door. Here the grief did not feel smaller, but it did feel farther away, as if distance could soften the edges of what the world had already taken. The year was 1891, and the pass lay a day and a half from any town where a telegraph key could shatter your name into the hands of strangers. The cabin was said to be sound, the creek faithful, the meadow patient. The man who had sold it to her in Salem swore he had loved the place, but loved his wife's temper more. Evelyn had smiled at that and thought of the way love bends a person without snapping them if they are lucky. The mule driver who brought her up the last miles was an old man with a tobacco cough and a hat brim that had forgotten straight lines. His name was Griffin, but he answered to Griff or Hay and seemed content with either. On the climb, he spoke of weather and wolves, and once with a glance at her gloved hands of blisters. He said little of people and less of himself. When the cabin came in sight, he reined up and tilted his chin like a man introducing a friend he had not seen in years. It was not a pretty place. Pretty had no business here. The roof was tight and low, the logs set true, the chinking clean where it should be and repaired where it had to be. A stump stood like a table not far from the door. A splitting maul leaned against it. There were canvas bundles in the shadow of the eaves where someone had once tried to keep something dry and lost the habit. The creek spoke in its small voice along the line of willows, and beyond it, a slope shouldered into fir and cedar until the trunks learned the patience of rock, and the rock learned the hunger of sky. Griff hauled her trunk to the porch and set it down as if laying a child in a cradle. He told her how to coax the stove to draw, how to set a kettle on two small flats to keep it from hopping like a trout. He pointed to a notch on the east post where someone had cut a mark to remember the last good harvest, and then another to remember the winter that tried to erase it. When he finished, he looked at her for a long moment. He was measuring, not doubting. "There is a difference." "You will do," he said at last. "If you mean to." "I mean to," Evelyn said. She did not say forever. Nobody up here said forever. When Griff left, the silence stepped closer. It was not empty. It had birds in it, and the tick of old wood cooling in the sun, and the far throat clearing of water on rock. Evelyn stood in that silence with her coat still buttoned and the hat pin still tight, and felt the two lives inside her rub together like flint. Boston had made a widow of her and taught her how to square receipts and tell a doctor he was wrong with a voice that did not tremble. Cedar Pass would teach her other things or kill her trying. She worked until the light went thin and the cabin had a shape that felt like hers. The broom met corners that had been left alone too long. She found a pair of boots by the door, cracked at the instep and too large. She did not touch them, as if they belonged to someone who might come back for them if she did. In a drawer, she found a small paper packet tied with string. Inside were seeds and a scrap of paper with a hand that had leaned hard on its letters. "Beans," it said in one line. "Mercy" in the next. That night, she built the fire the way Griff had told her and listened to the stove learn the room. She ate bread and jerky not because she was hungry, but because habit is a kind of faith. When the moon lifted its white coin over the ridge, she loosened the hat pin and unbuttoned the coat and sat on the edge of the bed with her hands quiet in her lap. She had taken the name Hale back into her mouth on the train west, rolling it on her tongue like a pebble until it felt right. In Boston, the name had worn a ring alongside another name, and the two had made a circle big enough for a baby to stand inside. The circle had broken in winter. A cough had taken her husband first. A smaller cough had followed harder. Grief had moved in and had not paid rent. When the letter came from a cousin of a cousin about land in Oregon, Grief sat up and watched her read. In the morning, the fog lay down along the creek. It looked like wool torn from a sheep that had outrun its fear. Evelyn laid a fire-boiled coffee that tasted like the inside of a tin pail and took stock. She had flour, salt, lard, a shallow tin of baking powder, a sack of oats, a jar of late raspberries floating in syrup, a coil of rope, a little barrel of nails, a hammer, an auger, 3 good knives, 2 poor ones, a needle roll, and a Bible that her mother had left with a pressed violet at King's 19. She had the seeds. She had the boots that did not fit and the maul that would. She had her breath and two hands that did not mind learning. By noon, the sun pushed the fog up the hill like a broom. Evelyn took the maul to the stump and learned the grain of the rounds, where to set the wedge, and where to let the knot have its way. She split until her palms burned under the gloves, and the wood stacked into a small wall that would not stop a winter, but would tame the teeth of an evening. She wanted to sleep then, to lay her cheek to the cool board and float, but she took up the bucket instead and went to the creek. The water was quick and cold. It ran with the impatience of a child. She knelt and watched a beetle ride a leaf like a man in a small boat, and wondered if he told his beetle wife where he had gone, or if he simply put out his legs and trusted the push. The thought made her laugh once softly, and the sound surprised her. She was not sure when she had last laughed without measuring it first. On the far bank, the trees held their breath. A deer showed its head, and then its shoulder considered her and put itself back together with the forest. A jay scolded the world for being more than it could count, and then flew away from its own complaint. When Evelyn stood, the sun made a bright seam along the rim of her bucket. She saw him then, not a clear sight, not at first. The eye notices motion, then shape, then story. Motion came as a slip of shadow where shadow should have been steady. Shape followed as a taller dark against the darker boles. Then story, which is what the mind throws over a thing when it wants to wear understanding. He stood among the firs and did not lean. His hat brim was low, and his shoulders looked like they had learned to carry what other men put down. He was too far to make out the face. It did not matter. It was enough to know she was seen. Evelyn did not raise a hand. She did not run. She did what a person does when a hawk watches a field mouse. She pretended to be a stump. She finished with more care than was needed the act of lifting the bucket. She turned and walked to the cabin. She did not hurry. When she set the bucket on the porch and turned back to look, the trees had their forest again, and no extra pieces. That night she barred the door. She set the poker near the stove and the small knife under the straw tick. She told herself stories about the dark, the way a mother tells a child about thunder so the child can sleep. She said out loud because sometimes the air must have words to carry that men up here minded their ground and left a woman to hers unless invited. She said that if a man meant harm, he would not stand silent and vanish like a guilt. The days found their order. Mornings belonged to woodwater and small mending. Afternoons belonged to learning the shapes of the land. She found a stand of willow that would answer her with baskets when she learned the tongue of it. She found a seam of clay near the bend where the creek bit at its own bank. She found old elk sign a salt lick scratched into a story of hooves and patience, and a rock where some hand long ago had peeled flakes from harder stone until a blade lay in the dust. Each discovery tugged at the small threads that tied her to fear and loosened one. On the fourth day, it rained. It was not a town rain that comes fast and leaves faster. It was a mountain rain, steady and reasonable, as if the sky had made a list and meant to see it done. Evelyn sat at the small table with the Bible closed under her palm and a paper and pencil she had been saving for a day when words might help more than they hurt. She wrote her name at the top to prove she could still make it. She wrote the date to anchor the name to time. Then she wrote the first line that came. Today I was watched and did not fall apart. She set the pencil down and looked at the words until they gave up their stiffness and lay quiet. The fire ticked like a woman knitting. The rain stitched the roof to the world. Somewhere a branch let itself down with a wet thud, and the sound did not trouble her. In the evening, when the rain had softened to a whisper and the creek held its breath to listen, a knock came at the door. It was not loud. It was the kind of knock a person makes when they know the difference between a door and a wall. Evelyn stood and her heart tried to step backward while her feet tried to step forward. She felt both and chose neither for a moment. Then she went to the door and said with a voice she had set carefully on the shelf for this use, "Who is there?" The answer came low and even carrying through wood, as if the grain of the door liked the shape of the words. "They told me you were alone on this side of the ridge," the man said. "I brought you a beam and 2 braces. The creek has a mind to rise this month. Roofs listen when you speak to them with the right timber." Evelyn's hand found the bar and lifted it. She opened the door to rain smell and a man whose hat dripped at the brim and whose eyes did not hurry. He held a length of squared cedar on one shoulder, A second shorter piece leaned against his hip. The tools at his belt did not jangle because he had learned how to carry them so they would not. I have coffee, she said before she could think better. I have muscle, he said. We will make a fair trade. They stood there a breath longer, like two trees feeling the same wind, and then the story of Cedar Pass, which had been waiting for both of them, took a step forward. The man set the beam down with a care that belonged to someone who knew the cost of split fibers and wasted effort. Water slid from the brim of his hat and stitched itself into the puddles on the porch. His coat had the color of weathered bark and the kind of wear that happens when a thing is used for its purpose and never for show. Up close, Evelyn could see the tempering in him the mountains give to iron and to men. Not hardness exactly, but a steadiness that refuses to hurry unless there is fire. She stepped aside and let him in. The room rearranged itself slightly around his size. He put the shorter brace against the wall, leaned the longer on his shoulder again, and glanced at the rafters the way a doctor might look at a wrist before setting a bone. He took off his hat and the rain let go of him in narrow threads. His hair was dark and cut by a knife that meant well, and his face wore the kind of beard a man keeps because he would rather sharpen a tool than chase a razor. The corner there sags, he said, nodding toward the northeast, where the wind had the habit of leaning. Nothing fatal if you give it a spine before the river remembers its appetite. I do not know the river's moods, Evelyn said. I have only known town water. It stops at a faucet when you tell it. He smiled small and honest. This creek is not the kind that takes orders, but it listens to stones stacked right and to water led where it wants to go anyway. She showed him the mugs and the small tin of coffee. The stove breathed well. The room smelled of smoke and iron and warm wet wool. He set his hat on the chair back as if the chair were a friend he had not seen since yesterday, and stood inside the doorway long enough for the rain to shake itself out of his coat. When he moved, it was with a quiet that did not come from trying to be quiet, but from knowing how each piece of himself should go. I am Evelyn Hale, she said, because a name is a bridge and sometimes a gate. I bought this place from a man with a story about his wife who loved summer better than snow. Linus Porter, he said. He loved neither. He loved winning at cards until he lost. I am Arlen Frost. The coffee found the mugs and carried steam the way a horse carries a rider, who does not weigh much but knows the trails. Arlen took his cup in both hands and looked toward the rafters again. I will show you the measure, he said, and we will make the brace together so that when your hands lift it next time, they will remember before your head does. They went outside. The rain had thinned to a fretful mist. The ridge kept its hat of cloud, and the creek talked to itself in a tone that said it was finished being polite. Arlen measured the span with a bit of cord, held it against the cedar, and nicked the place where the tenon would go with the tip of his knife. He set the beam on 2 blocks, drew lines with a carpenter's pencil that had been whittled down to a stout heart, and handed her the saw. Cut only where the waste lives, he said. Let the parts that carry weight stay fat. She set the blade and began. The saw spoke in a steady rasp and threw up a smell like a clean memory of winter. Arlen braced the beam with one hand, but not tightly. He let her learn the balance. When she drifted off the line a hair, he said nothing. When she set the teeth again true, he nodded once, as if to say 2 things mattered more than perfection, attention, and correction. They worked like that for an hour, trading tools and places and small lessons. The tenon grew from the cedar shoulders, square cheeks trimmed the kind of fit that can be persuaded by a mallet, but not bullied. Arlen cut mortises in the brace posts with a chisel that wore its years in a shine along the bevel. Rain ticked on the brim of his hat where he had hung it under the eaves. Evelyn's gloves darkened where the cedar bled its pale gold. Inside, they lifted the new beam into the rafters with a rope and a length of sapling as a lever. Arlen showed her how to speak to a stubborn board by moving its need instead of its body. The beam seated with a sound a person can only hear once they have listened to wood long enough, a low, contented note that says, "Enough, I am home." Arlen tapped the pegs home and stood back with his head cocked. A drop of water fell from his eyebrow and landed on his lip. He licked it away without thinking. The cabin felt different underfoot. A small worry loosened its teeth in the corner of Evelyn's mind. She did not know she'd been clenching until something in her palms let go. "Thank you," she said. "I do not have money to pay a man to square me with the weather." "Then do not pay a man," he said. "Pay a neighbor. Pay with a pot of coffee and a promise to hand the other end of a log when asked." He watched the window where the light dragged cold gray into the room. And if the river comes out of its bed, come straight for my place. It sits 2 hands higher than yours by the cedars. No heroics. The word heroics landed in the room and looked around for a place to sit. Evelyn felt a flare of something foolish, then an old reflex from a younger woman who had believed bravery meant standing where you were put. She pushed it aside gently and let the older knowledge move forward. Sometimes courage is the work of putting your body in motion towards shelter. How far, she asked, to your place? A quarter mile as the crow flies, he said. Half that as the creek runs twice. That as a woman with sense walks in rain. Follow the rise along the big outcrop that looks like a sleeping dog. If you get to the snags that lift like fingers, you have gone too far and the mountain will tell you so under your feet. She poured more coffee and found bread, and a small jar with raspberries swimming in syrup dark as bruised plums. Arlen accepted the plate with a nod that made the food feel less like charity and more like an agreement between two people who understood that a meal is a kind of handshake. Who told you I was alone, she asked, because the door between questions and answers had opened and would stay that way only if used. Griff, he said. He worries more than he lets on. He does not bring anyone up here without telling me to keep my eyes open. He knew you would not like that. Said out loud, so he told me like a man sets a lamp on a sill and says nothing about the dark. I saw you yesterday, she said. The trees tried to have you, but my eyes insisted. I know, he said. His smile was quick like a fish that shows its back and is water again. You did not lift a hand or hurry. The deer went on eating. That told me you have sense and that your fear speaks in a language worth hearing. They ate. The rain loosened. The creek raised its voice a notch. Arlen set the empty plate on the table and stood. Walk your banks, he said. Move what will move. The river takes what it takes, but it can be invited to take the ground you choose, and not the ground where your stove stands. I will walk with you now. Tomorrow you will walk without me and tell the rocks your plan. They went down together to the creek. The water that had been a bright ribbon 2 days earlier wore a heavier coat now. It shouldered at the willows and tugged at the roots. Arlen showed her how to drag stones into short ribs that turned the force on itself. He taught her to read the surface where a V meant a hidden fist of rock, and a riffle meant shallow confidence, and a slack meant the quiet that collects behind a stubborn shape. As they worked, the day folded itself thinner. The ridge shrugged off its cloud shawl by degrees. They spoke little. When they did, the words were practical and the spaces between them did not ache. Arlen found a driftwood trunk heavy as a promise and levered it into a place where it would catch what the creek threw and keep it from wrapping around the post that held the porch corner honest. Evelyn's boots filled once and drifted on her feet until she poured them out. Her hands learned where whetstone lies to you and where it tells the truth. A jay came to scold, and a kingfisher came to mind its own work. Above them, a raven wrote a line in the air and did not bother to translate. When they had done what could be done for a day, Arlen stood with his hands on his hips and breathed like a man who has given a fair share to the afternoon. It will rise tonight, he said, not to the sill if we have judged right. But do not sleep like a saint. Sleep like a farmer with seed in the ground and weather in his ear. You make it sound almost like company, she said. This river that will not take orders. It is company, he said, not tame. But then neither are you. The words hung there between them, not heavy, but with the weight a plank has when it bridges water. Evelyn felt heat rise in her face and was grateful for rain that let a person claim weather for any color. She bent to pick a stray branch and carry it to the pile where small dry things waited to be turned into warmth. Arlen put his hat back on. He picked up his chisel and the mallet and the length of cord as a man gathers his thoughts. At the edge of the yard, he stopped and looked toward the ridge where the light had turned thin and pewter. I come down this way most days, he said. If you want me to look in, set your broom bristles up against the door jamb. If you would rather I walk past, lay them down. I will do as the broom says. That is a kind of magic, she said. No, he said with that small smile again. It is a way to keep the mouth from promising what the day might not let the feet deliver. When he had gone, the cabin found its shape around her again. She lit the lamp early, not out of fear, but because light makes a room confess its edges and nothing else. She set the broom bristles leaning up, then hesitated, considered, and let them stay. The rain found a steady tempo on the roof. The creek spoke louder. Somewhere in the dark, a branch tore free and did not trouble her door. She set her boots close by a shawl at the foot of the bed. a coil of rope by the threshold, the way Arlen had taught her, not for danger, but because sometimes a thing has to be ready. Toward midnight, the river stood up and tested the banks. It walked its hands along the willow roots she and Arlen had tucked tight that afternoon and pushed at the stones they had set to teach it manners. The cabin listened to its new beam say, "I am here." Evelyn slept between waking like a soldier who has learned the value of both. When she rose before dawn, the floor was dry. The air smelled of cedar and wet earth, and the broom bristles still pointed up like a small flag that said what it meant. The storm left in the slow, grudging way of old men giving up an argument. When the gray thinned into morning, a white crust of ice rimmed the creek, and a new calm hung over the hollow. The air was still damp enough to find every seam in a coat, but the wind had lost its knife edge. Evelyn stepped outside with her bucket and breathed in the smell of clean wood smoke and thawing soil. The cabin held fast. The roofline stood straight where it had sagged before. The beam they'd raised sang a faint note when the cold sunlight touched it, a reminder that cedar never forgets the sound of work well done. She thought of Arlen's words about sleeping like a farmer. She had slept, and now she was the only creature awake in a world that looked rinsed of sin. For the first time since she'd come to the pass, she felt the day move with her instead of against her. She fed the stove-brewed coffee and took it outside to drink by the porch rail. Steam rose in the still air and wandered off toward the trees. There were prints in the soft earth near the path. Not boot prints, those she knew, but the oval pads of a wolf, large and sure, crossing her yard and gone again. She knelt, tracing the mark with her finger, and whispered a greeting as if the animal could hear. In Boston, she would have called a constable for less. Here she simply said, "Be kind," and stood. By mid-morning, the sun had enough heat to send rivulets down from the roof. She worked with her sleeves rolled and her braid tucked under a kerchief, carrying debris down to the riverbank where the water had fallen back into its bed. It was then she saw the bundle wedged in the roots of a fallen willow, a small tin box, battered but whole, the sort of thing a traveler might keep matches in. She pried it loose, wiped away the mud, and opened it. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a photograph, gone soft at the edges, and a strip of paper folded many times. The picture showed a young woman standing before the very same cabin, her hair pinned neat and her expression proud. On the paper, written in the precise hand of someone educated but tired, were 6 words. "If you find this, remember me." The ink had bled, but the plea still held its shape. Evelyn closed the tin and pressed it to her chest. The woman's eyes stared at her from another season, asking for witness. She carried the box inside and set it on the mantel beside her lamp. That night she dreamed of a voice calling from underwater, clear and low, saying, "It is your turn to stay." The next day Arlen came. He arrived without sound except for the creek announcing him with a splash. The broom still leaned bristles up in the jam, and she was not surprised when he stepped into view. He looked as if the storm had scoured him too. His coat darkened his beard, carrying frost that hadn't yet melted. She lifted her hand in greeting. "You kept your roof," he said. "And my courage," she answered. "I'm not sure which took more nails." He chuckled, a rough sound that warmed the air. Together they walked the bank, checking the places they'd shored up. Most of it held. A few stones had rolled. A tree had shifted its footing, but the cabin stood where it should. When they finished, he crouched by the fire pit she'd built near the porch and blew on the coals until a spark took hold. Smoke drifted sweet with sap. "The past gave you a fair trial," he said. "She likes to see what people are made of before she lets them belong. Does she ever let them leave?" "Sometimes," he said, staring into the flames. "But mostly she changes them until they don't want to." Evelyn fetched the tin box and handed it to him. He turned it over, a thumb tracing the dents, then opened it. The photograph caught the light. He looked long enough for recognition to settle across his face. "That was Clara Porter," he said softly. "Linus's first wife. She died one winter when the roof failed, and the snow came in faster than he could shovel it out. He blamed the mountain. The mountain blamed no one. He never told me," Evelyn said. "He just sold me the place and said his wife didn't like snow." "Some truths don't travel well," Arlen said, closing the lid. "But you found her." They buried the box under the willow that evening. Arlen cut a small cross from cedar and set it upright in the wet ground. Evelyn felt a quiet settle between them, not sorrow exactly, but a kind of reverence. The past had claimed many names before theirs. It would keep claiming them after. The act of remembering felt like a promise to both the living and the lost. Over the next weeks, winter softened into the first hints of spring. Snow retreated into the shaded hollows and the creek changed its song. Evelyn learned the timing of meltwater and how to set traps for rabbits without cruelty. She built shelves, patched the chimney, and planted the seeds marked beans and mercy in a small strip of dark soil behind the cabin. Every morning she checked the ground for green. Arlen came often, but never without reason. Sometimes he brought flour or oil. Sometimes he asked her to hold the other end of a plank. Sometimes they talked over coffee about nothing at all, which turned out to be something important. When he spoke of his life before the ridge, it came in fragments. A younger brother gone missing in the war, a house by a river that flooded once too often, a decision to go where the noise of men couldn't follow. Evelyn listened, adding his fragments to her own until their silences matched. One evening they sat outside watching the last snow slide off the ridge in slow avalanches. The sky above them was pale and clean, the kind that makes you believe tomorrow might forgive today. Arlen took a small pouch from his coat and poured a few kernels of grain into his palm. For the birds, he said, scattering them near the porch. They remember kindness better than people do. She smiled. You don't seem short on memory. It depends on what I'm trying to forget. They watched until the sparrows came small flashes of brown hopping in the mud. The air smelled of thawing pine and riverstone. Evelyn's hand brushed against his on the railing. He didn't move away, but neither did he reach for her. They stood like that until the light faded. When he left, she felt the absence not as loneliness, but as space waiting to be filled. She wrote in her notebook before sleeping, "The mountain asked nothing but patience. The man asked nothing but truth. I have both if I can keep them." The next morning brought wind from the south, warm and strange. It carried scents of sap and distant rain. She stepped outside and saw smoke rising from beyond the sleeping dog outcrop, Arlen's side of the ridge. Thicker than usual, darker. The kind of smoke that comes from green wood or from hurry. She hesitated only long enough to throw on her coat. The broom by the door toppled as she passed, as if pushed by an unseen hand. She ran along the path the creek had taught her, boots splashing in shallow water, heart drumming in her throat. When she reached the clearing, she saw the source one of Arlen's sheds collapsed at the roof flames, licking through the planks. He was there, swinging a bucket, cursing softly with each throw. Without asking, she joined him. They worked until the fire surrendered, leaving only a black scar and the smell of resin. Arlen straightened, soaked and smeared with ash. He looked at her and laughed, a sound rough with exhaustion, but alive. "Seems I'm the one needs saving today. We can trade favors," she said, breathless. They stood in the steam rising from wet wood, their faces streaked with soot. He reached out, then slow and deliberate, and wiped a smear from her cheek with his thumb. His hand lingered a heartbeat too long. She didn't flinch. "Thank you," he said, "for coming." "Neighbors," she said, though the word felt too small for what passed between them. He nodded once, serious now. "Neighbors, yes, until the mountain decides otherwise." The wind shifted, carrying the smell of rain. She looked toward the horizon where clouds built like walls, heavy and dark. Another storm coming, but not of snow this time. Something wilder, full of water and change. She felt it in her bones, the way the earth feels thunder before it hears it. And as they turned back toward the cabin, walking side by side through the damp grass, she wondered whether the next flood would come from the sky or from the heart. The storm did not ask permission. It came over the ridge like a memory that refused to stay buried, dragging its skirts through the treetops until the sky went black with movement. By nightfall, the wind had stripped branches and flung them against the cabin, with the desperation of birds trying to get inside. The first thunder rolled low and closed the sound of the earth clearing its throat. Evelyn barred the door and pushed extra wood beside the stove. She had lived through storms now, but something about this one felt deliberate, as if the mountain itself had decided to see what they were both made of. The rain came in sheets. It hammered the roof until the new beam groaned, but held. She lit the lanterns and laid blankets against the sill, where water wanted in. From time to time, she thought she heard something moving beyond the window's branches, maybe, or the creek, remembering where it used to run before men told it otherwise. She tried to sleep and failed. Instead, she wrote by lantern light, the words shaking with each gust. "If the mountain must test me, let it find me working." Close to dawn, the noise changed. Thunder fell away, and the constant drumming softened into a rush, steady and close. She stepped to the door and felt the air go damp and cold. The creek had swollen overnight, spilling across the low bank where they'd built their stone ribs. It glittered faintly in the half-light, wide as a road now. In the distance between flashes of lightning, she saw a figure on the rise, dark coat hat, pressed down, moving toward her through the rain. Arlen. She ran to meet him halfway, the mud clutching her boots. He was shouting before she reached him. The ridge split trees down on the south side. The river's taken the path straight to your door. She looked past him and saw it then, a wall of water curling out from the bend, dragging half the forest with it. Arlen grabbed her wrist and pulled her toward the higher ground behind the cabin. "Leave it," he said. "The rest can be rebuilt." They climbed until the ground rose steep enough for the water to lose interest. From there, she watched her home become an island. The garden vanished first, then the woodpile. The porch took the water up to its knees and trembled, but stood. When the rush finally broke and spread into slower current, the cabin remained a dark square in a sea of moving silver. "It's holding," she said, half disbelieving. "For now." Arlen's voice was close to her ear. "You'll stay with me until it settles." He led her along the ridge path, the same one she had followed weeks before to his clearing. The storm kept at their backs. By the time they reached his door, both were soaked and shaking. He pulled her inside, stripped the wet from his coat, and threw logs into the hearth until the fire caught and roared. The sudden heat filled the small room with the smell of pine and smoke and wool. "Sit," he said. "I'll find you something dry." He brought a flannel shirt and a pair of trousers tied at the waist with rope. They belonged to him, of course. They swallowed her whole. She changed behind the screen he pulled across the corner, her clothes heavy as memory in her arms. When she stepped out, he was at the fire turning a kettle with one hand. He looked up, saw her, and smiled, not at her awkwardness, but at the sight of her alive. "Better," he said. "You're starting to look like a mountain woman." "And you," she said, "like a man who's forgotten the world below." "I tried to," he said quietly, "until you came knocking." They ate what he had, a pot of beans, half a loaf, the kind of food that fills more than it pleases. The rain thudded on the roof until the world outside disappeared. Every so often the fire jumped, and the shadows on the walls leaned in and back like listeners. When he spoke again, his voice carried something it hadn't before. "I lost a place once," he said, "in Montana. I built it myself, spent 5 years cutting and fitting, and when the river rose, it took everything in one night. The next morning, I walked until my legs gave out. When I woke, I was on this mountain, and I stayed because the wind didn't ask my name." She watched the firelight slip across his face, and now the wind has learned it again. He met her eyes. "Maybe that's what frightens me." Outside, the storm began to break. The rain thinned to a whisper, the thunder moved farther down the valley. In the hush that followed, they sat side by side on the floor, before the fire, not touching, but close enough to feel the warmth travel between them. She could hear the slow ticking of the stove, cooling the faint hiss of water dripping from her hair to the stone hearth. "You'll need to start again," he said, "when the ground dries." "Then I will," she said. "It isn't the first time." "You don't have to alone." The words hung between them like smoke. She looked at him, this man who spoke little and meant every word he did. She thought of the nights he had walked the creek to be sure her chimney still smoked the beam they had lifted together, the box they had buried the way his hands had known exactly how much strength to use. She thought, too, of how long she had carried her own silence, mistaking it for strength. "Maybe I don't," she said finally. He reached for her, then slow enough that she could stop him if she wished. She didn't. His hand found hers rough and warm, and for a long time they stayed that way. Fingers twined, eyes on the fire. The air smelled of cedar and rain, and something new that neither dared name. When she woke the next morning, sunlight poured through the cracks of the shutters. The storm had gone, leaving behind a world reshaped. Steam rose from the soaked earth. Birds moved cautiously through the dripping branches. Arlen was already outside, boots deep in the mud, studying the valley below. She joined him on the ridge, the air sharp with the scent of pine. The flood had changed everything. The meadow where her garden had been was a river plain now, silver threads winding between islands of rock and debris. Yet the cabin stood tilting a little, but whole roof dark and solid. She exhaled a sound halfway between laughter and relief. "She's still there," she said. "You built it honest," Arlen said. "Honest things hold." They spent the rest of the day salvaging what they could. They carried tools and a few dry sacks of flour up to his place. When the sun began to sink, they sat on the porch steps watching the light spread gold across the valley. Her hair had dried into loose waves that caught the fire of evening. His sleeves were rolled forearms streaked with mud and effort. Neither spoke for a while. Finally, she said, if I start over, I want it higher, closer to the trees. We'll build it together, he said simply. She turned to him. You talk as if it's decided. It is, he said. The mountain decided when she let us both live through last night. The firelight from inside his cabin threw a faint glow around them. The quiet that followed was not awkward. It was a room large enough to hold two people and what they were becoming. He reached out, touched a strand of her hair, and said, You've got ash in it. She smiled. Then leave it. It'll remind me what was burned and what survived. The wind came down from the ridge, soft now, carrying the scent of spring mud and cedar smoke. The river below murmured to itself, tired but alive. They sat together until the stars showed, and when the cold finally drove them inside, the door closed on a silence that felt less like solitude and more like belonging. The thaw came slow that year, as if the mountain wished to keep them close a little longer. Day by day, the snow retreated into the gullies, leaving behind slick stones and patches of earth so dark they looked like spilled ink. Evelyn and Arlen rebuilt in small steps, beginning with what they could carry, a roof plank here, a fence post there. Sometimes they worked side by side, sometimes in silence that felt like conversation. The cabin below dried out first. They cleared the silt from the floorboards, lifted each plank, brushed it clean, and set it again. Every stroke of the broom sounded like forgiveness. By the end of the second week, smoke was rising from the chimney again, a thin gray line stitching the house to the sky. Arlen stayed most nights now, though neither of them named it as such. His tools lived on her porch. His boots stood beside hers by the door. She still wrote in her small notebook each evening, but the entries grew shorter, less about survival, and more about what she noticed: the song of a returning thrush, the slow green on the beans, the way the river carried bits of light like fish scales. One morning, while the mist still lay in folds across the meadow, she found Arlen near the stream carving a plank. He was shaping it into something that did not yet reveal itself. Curls of wood fell around his boots, bright as honey in the damp grass. You've been at that for an hour, she said, holding out a cup of coffee. He took it with a nod, wiped the sweat from his brow, and smiled. It's a door sign, he said. Every home should have a name. And what will ours be called? He looked at her for a moment before answering. Mercy Ridge. It seems right. She thought of the tin box they had buried, of the seeds she had planted from it. Now small green shoots pushing through the soil. Yes, she said. Mercy suits us both. The weeks slipped into a pattern of making and mending. Arlen taught her how to shape dovetails, how to read a tree's heart before cutting. She showed him how to stretch linen, how to mend a tear without leaving a scar. Evenings brought them to the porch where they watched the sky bruise itself into twilight. Sometimes they spoke of the lives they had left behind, but more often they spoke of the life unfolding quietly between them. Plans for a second room, a proper chimney, maybe a stable. Once late in April, travelers passed through the valley, a pair of miners from the low country searching for a lost claim. They stopped for water and left a bundle of mail from the town below. Among the letters was one for Arlen, yellowed and thin. He opened it by the fire that night, eyes moving slowly across the lines. When he finished, he sat still for a long while. News, she asked gently. He folded the paper. From Montana. My brother's son says the war finally caught up to him years late. A fever took him last winter. She touched his hand. I'm sorry. He was the last of them, Arlen said. Now there's no one to write to but you. The words hung there soft and heavy. Evelyn reached for his hand again, and this time he held on. They stayed that way until the fire sank to embers. The next morning, the world began to bloom in earnest. Wildflowers pushed through the wet soil, and the ridge shone with new leaves. They worked in the garden together, bending over the neat rows until their shadows merged. When the sun dropped behind the western peaks, they lit a small fire and ate beside it. You ever think about leaving, she asked. I did, he said. Before you. Now I think about staying right here until the ridge forgets my name. Then we'll make sure it remembers both of ours, she said. He smiled, slow and sure. That sounds like a promise. Later that night, when the moon rose white over the valley, they sat at the table inside, a single candle between them. The light touched his face, and she saw not the hermit of the woods or the ghost of old wars, but a man simply alive, tired kind, unguarded. He reached across the table, took her hand, and said, We're home, Evelyn. That's all that matters. And she believed him. Because home wasn't the cabin or the mountain or even the river that had nearly undone them. It was the quiet heartbeat that filled the space between their breaths. In the months that followed, Mercy Ridge grew green again. Travelers began to speak of a woman and a man living high above Cedar Pass, offering food to the lost and shelter to the weary. Some said they were newlyweds, others that they were ghosts guarding the valley. Neither corrected them. By the time the next autumn came, the cabin stood solid against the wind, the beans in Mercy grown tall against the fence, and the river running true in its course. Evelyn would rise early to fetch water, watching the light spill down the mountainsides, and she would think how the world can break a person only to hand them back something stronger. On those mornings, Arlen would join her, wrapping his arms around her shoulders from behind, and they would stand together listening to the creek's endless conversation. It no longer sounded like warning or sorrow. It sounded like the voice of a place that had finally accepted them. Sometimes she would whisper, "We did it." And he would answer, "No, love. The mountain did it. We just learned to listen." The seasons turned as they always do. The snow returned and left again. The ridge held their names in its quiet heart, and the little cabin became a fixed point on maps no one drew. Those who passed through said they could see smoke curling from the chimney, even on still days, as if the place itself breathed. And somewhere within that circle of forest and stone, two people lived out their days the way the mountain had taught them, without hurry, without fear, with hands always ready to build again.